Get ready to take a flamethrower to the official narrative and learn what the elites don't want you to know. You're listening to The Tom Woods Show.
Hi everybody, Tom Woods here, episode 2627 of The Tom Woods Show. And we are welcoming today Dave DeCamp, who is news editor at antiwar.com and who comes with a sterling endorsement from the great Scott Horton, who tells me, look, man, you want to talk about, and then he lists a bunch of topics, says this guy knows more about them than I do. Wow, those are some tough shoes to fill there, Dave, but welcome to the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Tom. And Scott definitely knows more than me about, the history of things. Just want to make that clear. But yeah, my job for antiwar.com is basically to follow all the craziness happening around the world. So
yeah, so you are very up on exactly what's happening on a day-to-day basis. And we certainly need that these days. I remember there was a time after the war in Iraq where, during the war in Iraq, antiwar.com got massive viewership because we all felt like that's where, all the reliable articles about it can be found, and because you link to all these different publications. But then there was a time when foreign policy got kind of quiet for a while. But antiwar.com, continued doing its work. But what was going on in the world wasn't so dramatic as a war in Iraq. But now it's like the more work you have, the worse it is for the world, And these days you've got some work. So let's talk about them one at a time. Let's actually start with something a little bit off the beaten path, because it's not one of the topics immediately on everybody's minds. But I just saw that you wrote something about Pete Hegseth and China and Taiwan and war preparation. What was that all about?
yeah, so this just came out from the Washington Post. They had a report that last month, Pete Hegseth sent an internal memo ordering the Pentagon to put their focus on preparing for a war with China over Taiwan. And this is something the U.S. military has actually been doing, like out in the open for years, despite the risk of nuclear war. They come out, U.S. military officials, and say that they're preparing to fight and win a war with China. And really what the Hegseth memo said that was different than what kind of the official U.S. policy has been since the first Trump administration, which has been that, they've labeled China the top, threat facing the U.S. with Russia in second. That's been kind of the official position of the U.S. government for years now. But what the Hegseth memo did that was kind of interesting was basically saying that we're going to pull back from the rest of the world. And especially when it comes to Russia, which this aligns with what we've seen publicly, basically saying we want the Europeans to foot the bill, that if there's any kind of land war in Europe with Russia, we're not going to be involved. It's annoying because it's a Washington Post report. Of course, they didn't publish the full memo. So, my understanding of it is based on how they reported it. I wish I could read the full thing, but essentially what I got from it was that the order was, we're going to prepare for war with China. And when it comes to like direct conflict, direct fighting, this is all that's on our plate, is a future war with China. Russia, not so much. We're not as worried about it. We'll still back Europe with nuclear deterrence, but the big thing is China. And again, this does align with what we've seen over the years. I mean, even the Biden administration, their national defense strategy named China as the top threat. And this is something, in my job at antiwar.com, I've tried to put a lot of focus on China because I see the direction that we're heading. But with everything else happening in the world, it's been tough to kind of cover it. So it is important for people to kind of be aware. And all these things that happened under Biden, all these plans to build new bases, to expand military bases in Australia, the Philippines, and Pacific Island nations. And again, when they do this, they're saying we have to do this so when there's a war with China, there's more targets for China to hit. So this is about preparing for war. So it's very concerning, and it's something that's still going on despite everything else that has our attention.
Is there anybody at all in the, let's say, mainstream foreign policy world who isn't on some level a China hawk? I think Daniel Davis was willing to consider that Colonel Doug McGregor was right to say that we do not need to say that China is our enemy. But it seems like everybody, like even like half my viewers, are thinking I'm naive because I don't see China as the enemy. Well, I read, Joe Mullen's book. What's his full name?
Joseph Solis Mullen.
Yes.
Yeah, the fake China threat.
The fake China threat, right? But is there anybody
in the mainstream? I mean, it's tough to say. I've seen Rand Paul. He's been pretty good on this.
Yeah.
He's really the only one in Congress that I've seen say, we got to slow down. We're marching toward war with China. Because if you watch like the Senate hearings when they talk about China, I mean, it's just completely hysterical, saying China's like the biggest threat the U.S. has ever faced in its history. And you mentioned, guys like John Mearsheimer, who I'm a huge fan of John Mearsheimer. He's a friend of antiwar.com. But even he believes, I think his views might have changed in recent years, basically that, Taiwan would be worth defending for the U.S. So it is like, there's a lot of people who otherwise, are great on foreign policy, but when it comes to China and Taiwan, things are different. And again, it's tough to imagine now with everything that's going on because the U.S. has been trying to pivot to Asia since Obama, basically, but they just kept getting bogged down and intervening more in the Middle East, and we're seeing that now. So again, it's tough to really kind of think about this, but I mean, they're deploying these new missile systems to the Philippines that can hit China. I mean, these are very provocative things that are happening. And another big part of it is like the alliance building. All these military drills happening between Japan and South Korea and the Philippines and Australia. Like, there's just a lot at play here that people aren't really focusing on. And you're right, when it comes to China, because I've picked up, over the years with opposing the intervention in Ukraine, we've picked up a lot of like, Trump supporters, more right-leaning people. And whenever I start talking about China, they all kind of, tell me, China's our real threat, the real enemy. Like you said, it does seem to be a pretty widespread belief.
Yeah. So very hard to find dissident voices. Episode 2415. So tomwoods.com/2415. I talked about the book, The Fake China Threat. So worth looking into for anybody interested in that. All right, so let's talk about the topics that people would expect us to talk about on this kind of an episode. Now, yesterday I talked to Dan McCarthy, and we were speaking very generally about various areas in which Trump is turning out to be less than desirable. And some of that was domestic and some foreign. And we covered it in a very breezy way. But I'd like to spend a little more time on it with you. And that, first, I suppose we might as well start with the Yemen situation. Now, this is a case where we have him on tape, so to speak, we have him on a recording, saying that this bombing that Biden was doing of Yemen didn't need to be done. You don't have to be bombing all the time. But apparently you do. So can you explain to people, who are just ordinary people who their instincts are that we shouldn't be doing this, but they don't know who the Houthis are or what any of it's all about, or whether maybe they really are pirates who need to be given the what for? Just give us the background.
Yeah. So this is one of those things, I could kind of understand some people who really don't have knowledge of what's happened in Yemen over the years or aren't paying attention. And then just kind of the narrative that, we have to protect the shipping lanes. Isn't that what the U.S. Navy is for anyway? I could sympathize with people who hear that and say, yeah, that makes sense. But the really important thing to understand, there's a few important things, but when it comes to the current situation and what's happening and what the Houthis are doing, this starts back in 2023, October 7th. Israel unleashes its horrific war on Gaza. And then the Houthis, they start targeting Israeli shipping in the region, essentially saying that they've put a blockade on Israel in response to the slaughter of Palestinians in Gaza. And then, there were some things that happened toward the end of 2023. The U.S. formed this international coalition against the Houthis. And then Biden started bombing them in January 2024. And they started attacking U.S. ships in response and British ships because the British got involved. So it kind of just made the whole situation worse. Biden bombed them for a year, from January 2024 to January 2025. Didn't stop them. What did stop them was on January 19th this year, a ceasefire went into effect in Gaza. And as the Houthis said all along, that's the only thing that would make them stop. They stopped their attacks. So I liked how Dave Smith had a good tweet about this when the U.S. started bombing Yemen again. He's, opposing it and saying I like the way he phrased it. He said, The good news is there's a diplomatic solution. And the diplomatic solution is getting Israel to implement the full ceasefire deal that they signed in January. And Trump and the U.S. could do that because Israel is 100% reliant on U.S. military aid to conduct these bombings in Gaza and impose this blockade on Gaza. So that's kind of one of the really important points about the current moment. And another thing, because you even see this with Trump, like yesterday he had a tweet about this saying, to the Houthis, if you stop firing at U.S. ships, we'll stop firing at you. But the thing is that they did stop once the ceasefire went into effect, and they didn't actually start again until Trump started bombing them again. Trump bombed them in response to the Houthis saying that they were going to start imposing their blockade on Israeli shipping again, because Israel imposed a total blockade on all food, aid, and everything entering Gaza on March 2nd, total violation of the ceasefire deal. So it was in response to that the U.S. started bombing them again. And then the other context here that's really important is who the Houthis are. Their official name is Ansar Allah. They're a Zaidi Shiite, Islamist movement that comes from North Yemen. This area of North Yemen that they control, it was ruled by Zaidi Shia imams for 1,000 years until the 1960s. So you see the media coverage of them, they're never just described as the Houthis or Ansar Allah or as the Yemeni government in this part of Yemen. They're always called the Iranian-backed Houthi rebels. And the fact is that they're not rebels anymore. They've controlled the capital Sana'a since 2014, and they govern an area of Yemen where 80% of Yemenis live. So they are the governing power in that part of Yemen. And the Iranian-backed part, they are allied with Iran, but we don't know the extent that Iran actually provides them support. And they are by no means beholden to Iran. They're not going to take orders from Iran. This is something U.S. officials actually just recently acknowledged to the Washington Post, that they're unlikely to take orders from Iran because they act independently. And they have their own domestic weapons supply. They produce their weapons domestically. They have missiles and drones that are similar to Iranian ones, and Iran probably helped them develop these weapons systems, but they make them themselves, which means, if Iran wants them to stop, they don't have any power. They can't cut off the weapons, because we've seen Trump saying he's going to blame Iran for every Houthi attack and telling them to make them stop, but they don't have the power to make them stop. And that's another really important point. And then the other thing is that from 2015 to 2022, the U.S. backed a brutal war in Yemen, a Saudi-UAE war against the Houthis. That, this is actually what made me start writing for antiwar.com, because I was so horrified by it. In 2018, they bombed a school bus full of kids, killed about 60 of them. And at the time, I was involved in some anti-war activism, but the problem was nobody even knew what the war in Yemen was. Like, you can't go protest a war when nobody even knows what you're talking about. So that's what got me into writing. But so the important point here is that was a brutal war, heavy bombing campaign, total blockade imposed by the U.S. Navy on Yemen, starvation campaign, bombing all the civilian infrastructure. And what happened to the Houthis during that time? Were they defeated? No, they actually became better fighters. They started developing their missiles and drones more, and they started to hit Saudi oil fields, and that's what essentially made the Saudis sue for peace. So if they survive that, this bombing campaign is not going to stop them. And that's very clear if you're looking at the events that we've seen over the past 2 weeks. They started attacking U.S. warships again and firing missiles at Israel, and they're not stopping. So, if you want to protect the shipping lanes, you can't bomb this problem away. That's an important thing for people to understand.
Hey, everybody, you know how much I was paying for health insurance for my kids and me, not including my wife, who had a separate policy? Over $3,000 a month. $3,000 a month. Well, we're not doing that anymore. Now, listen to me. You just got to put your foot down the way I did. There is absolutely no way you are pleased with your health insurance policy, or particularly what you're paying for it. So I urge you to do what the Woods family does. Restore sanity to your health care with Crowd Health. It's not health insurance, but that's a good thing. It's a better way to pay for health care through crowdfunding. For $175 for an individual or $575 for a family of 4 or more, you'll get access to a community of people who are willing to help out in the event of an emergency. And you get access to telemedicine visits, discounted prescriptions, and so much more. And you don't have to worry about doctors' networks. Let Crowd Health help with your healthcare needs. Get started today for just $99 per month for your first 3 months. Go to joincrowdhealth.com and use code WOODS. Crowd Health is not insurance. Learn more at joincrowdhealth.com. That's joincrowdhealth.com. And remember, code WOODS. Well, as Dan said, and this is obviously not original to him, a major concern, despite the anti-war rhetoric of the Trump people, is, up till recently, is that if Trump really is committed to just carrying on this bombing over and over again, mercilessly, and it continues to have no effect, then it seems plausible he could be talked into the argument that, well, if you really want to try to put the kibosh on this, you have to go to the source, and that's Iran. And then, it's Katie bar the door. I mean, what do you think that's plausible?
Yeah, it's like I said, how he's blaming Iran. He's putting out all these tweets. He just said something yesterday. Basically, these attacks continue. The worst pain is yet to come for the Houthis and for their sponsors in Iran. And this was one thing I feared. Like during the transition, I thought he could be talked into doing this because I think the way that they would frame it, be like, oh, it's just like ISIS in Iraq and Syria. Remember, you just obliterated them with bombs. The big difference there is that you had all these different forces on the ground, pretty much all the local forces, the Syrians, the Iraqis, even the Russians were there, the Iranians helping on the ground, the Kurds fight ISIS, and everybody wanted them out of there. In Yemen, it's a completely different situation. You can't just bomb, with no ground campaign. And so, if he could be talked into that, I think he could be talked into bombing Iran because it seems like he's just taking the worst advice from the people in his administration who want all these escalations. And there's other risks too with Iran. We're seeing all the nuclear talk about, Trump just said if they don't make a nuclear deal, they're going to be bombed, basically. I forget exactly what his wording was, but he's like, it's going to be the biggest bombing that anybody's ever seen or something like that. So that's another factor. But yeah, and the other factor is Israel is the Netanyahu factor. Right now, Trump is showing that he's willing to bomb other countries basically to protect Israel, because that's what this thing in Yemen is about, to be very clear, because the Houthis started hitting Israel with missiles. They never really hit them, they've all been intercepted, but they're firing missiles at Israel. And according to Israeli media, the U.S. told Israel, don't worry, we got this. You guys don't have to respond. We'll take care of it. So if you're Netanyahu, who's in battle at home, and he's just interested in being in a state of war, and he wants to cut the head off the snake, as he always says, referring to Iran, we're kind of in a different world post-April 2024. April 2024 was when Iran fired its first direct missile and drone attack at Israel. And what did they do that in response to? Israel bombing their consulate in Damascus in Syria. They had to respond. They bombed a diplomatic facility in the middle of the day, killed a bunch of Iranians, so Iran responded. If Netanyahu, is looking to provoke a war with Iran, he could bomb a Iranian facility in Lebanon. He's been escalating in Beirut with strikes on Beirut. There's ways that he could probably try to provoke Iran into doing something, and then getting the U.S. to back kind of the response, the counterstrikes to that. I think that's a real possibility here.
Well, the other side of this is the concern about an alleged, the stated concern about an alleged Iranian nuclear program. And this just won't go away. Now, if it were the case, if they were on the verge of getting a nuclear missile, then we'd have a different kind of conversation about what would the world look like if they had such a missile. But if they're not actually seeking one, and the U.S. and even U.S. intelligence is concluded that back in a major report in 2007, and even more recently, then what could this be about if it's a phantom problem? Again, it's like with Saddam, he was supposed to quote unquote disarm, but he had nothing to disarm, and so because he didn't quote disarm, they went and invaded. So is it in fact the case that there really is no such nuclear program, or that Iran is not 6 months away, as they apparently have been for the last 30 years?
Yeah, so like you mentioned, there was a recent the U.S. intelligence threat assessment that they put out every year came out last week, and they reaffirmed that Iran is not building a nuclear weapon and that there's no sign that the Ayatollah has reversed his 2003 ban on producing weapons of mass destruction. The big hype about Iran's nuclear program is the fact that they're enriching some uranium at the 60% purity level, which is still short of the 90% needed to build a weapon. And they started doing that in 2021. So that is the narrative, is that if they wanted to, they can quickly, break out and build a nuclear weapon. And the Iranians have kind of been playing into that narrative recently. In the face of Israel's kind of aggression in the region, there's been more talk in Iran among members of parliament, the hardliners, as they call them. We certainly have hardliners here in the U.S. too. But saying things like, "Oh, we should reconsider the ban on making nukes." And again, there's been no sign that the Ayatollah is interested in that. But just yesterday, an advisor to the Ayatollah, and he's got a lot of advisors, so it's tough to know how influential this guy really is, but this is being kind of reported by Iranian media, kind of being put at the top. So I guess this is a message that they want to put out. He's saying, if we're attacked, then we have no choice. Then I guess we might have to make a nuclear weapon. And this is part of Iran's strategy, basically since Trump withdrew from the Iran nuclear deal in 2018. They've kind of slowly increased their uranium enrichment. The idea is to get leverage in negotiations. And it's kind of been their policy that they respond to aggression against their nuclear program by increasing it. And this is important context because in 2021, why did Iran go from 20% enrichment, which had a civilian purpose, to the 60%? They did that because Israel planted a bomb in one of their nuclear facilities and blew it up in April. I think it was April 2021. And they did that to try to sabotage negotiations between the U.S. and Iran. It was the same weekend the U.S. and Iran, Biden started negotiations on potentially returning to the nuclear deal. So Israel, set off this bomb, and then Iran took this step. So that, it's part of they want there to be consequences for the aggression. But then the U.S., the hawks in the U.S. and Israel, they use those responses, as reason to be more aggressive toward Iran. So I think this strategy of theirs, that Iranian guy saying that yesterday, considering the climate, I think they're just, that's a very foolish thing to do, kind of play into this narrative. But right now, there is no evidence that they're building a nuclear weapon. And they know that if they do take that step, then that will basically guarantee the U.S. and Israel bombing them, especially now. So it is at this point still this kind of phantom thing, but the rhetoric has changed in Iran. Another thing that in recent years they started saying was, the Iranians started saying, well, if we wanted to build we're not building a nuclear weapon, but if we wanted to, you couldn't stop us. So you see these little shifts in their language. And I think they're still thinking that they can use their nuclear program as it is as leverage to stop the U.S. and Israel from bombing them and maybe enter a deal. So I'm really hoping that, there was just a back and forth between the U.S. and Iran. Trump sent them a letter proposing talks, but basically threatening that if there's not a deal within 2 months, they're going to get bombed. And then Iran responded through Oman. And there is always kind of these indirect talks happening between the U.S. and Iran. So I'm really hoping that something like that's happening behind the scenes. Yeah. But the Netanyahu, if it is, Netanyahu's going to want to sabotage that.
Hey gang, here's how to never pay for a book again. Think of the hot issues of our day: gender theory, so-called, Ukraine, the Federal Reserve, or guns, or education, including how would a free society provide it? Well, I've got a free ebook on all of them from a dissident perspective. I've also got obliterations of the worldviews of Bernie Sanders and AOC. I've got a pretty darn good book on national divorce and a whole bunch more. I've got over a dozen. And you can pick whichever one you like, or you can have them all. It's up to you. Find them all at tomsfreebooks.com. In fact, the next time you're about to pull out your credit card to buy a book, think to yourself, wait a minute, didn't old Woods try to save me from this fate of endlessly throwing money at books? Head over to tomsfreebooks.com. Jeez, this is This ain't easy. Living in the U.S. and watching this and being helpless to stop it. Apart from reporting on it, you don't know what else to do. Just very, very discouraging. Let's talk about something else, even though there's plenty to talk about on this stuff, but there's so many things going on, Dave, right now. So we also have the ongoing Russia-Ukraine situation. And we have Trump threatening tariffs on Russia and saying how unhappy he is with Putin. And I was saying yesterday to Dave, to Dan McCarthy, I wonder if even a small percentage of that is Trump wants people off his back for 3 seconds, and so he can be able to say, look, I'm upset at him too. I don't like Putin either. So I don't know what the deal is, or it's a matter of I'm expending an enormous amount of political capital trying to bring about some kind of a resolution of this, and if you don't cooperate, that, I've expended it for nothing, and I could see him being upset. But where do you think, so where do things stand? Like, what are the two sides wanting, and how likely is it that we can somehow get them both what they want somehow?
Yeah, I mean, where things stand now, basically, it looks like there's negotiations kind of ongoing on this idea of like a partial ceasefire. They both agreed to not hit energy infrastructure and for this Black Sea, like to not hit ships in the Black Sea. And I mean, we see just about every day there's accusations that, one side, the Russians are saying the Ukrainians are still firing drones at the energy infrastructure inside Russia. But for the most part, it seems like those attacks have stopped, or at least, there's a lot less of them than there has been. So hopefully that makes progress. But yeah, I mean, right now, it seems like the negotiations are focused just on that, just on getting like this kind of a few little deals here to progress toward a ceasefire and like a permanent, lasting peace deal. So it's hard to really know what's happening behind the scenes. I think, this is one thing that is much better. Like I'm way less concerned about war with Russia just because the fact that they're talking, that if like something does happen, say the Ukrainians fire a missile in a really sensitive area of Russia, the U.S. and Russia are more likely to get on the phone now about it than just kind of start firing missiles at each other. So like, I think the risk of nuclear war is way down just because of that. But yeah, things aren't looking too promising now because, we have Zelensky and Putin and the Russians saying, I mean, they're just completely far apart on a permanent peace deal. And this could just be part of the negotiations. Like, again, we don't really know exactly what's being said behind the scenes. We have Zelensky and other Ukrainian officials saying, oh, no, we're not giving up any territory. When the reality is, if they want a peace deal, they're going to have to give up that territory that Russia occupies now in eastern Ukraine. So it's, I think these Trump public comments, these threats that he's making, they're not good, but I don't think Russia's really taken them that seriously. Because I've seen kind of, I always read the Russian media and like the Kremlin's response to what Trump said, like they kind of just brushed it off. I think the fact that there does seem to be an earnest effort by the Trump administration to have a relationship with Russia, to build trust, and that might not turn into a ceasefire anytime soon. I mean, really what I'm thinking is that this is probably going to go on still for a while, and it's going to be a little while before like a deal is reached here. And the fighting on the Eastern Front is going to probably continue. I mean, that's the way I'm reading it right now.
There's a new report in the New York Times. I suppose you saw it. And there's an article about it at the Libertarian Institute. New York Times investigation reveals new details about the U.S. proxy war in Ukraine. Did you happen to see that report?
Yeah.
So what did we learn about the extent of the U.S. involvement that we might not have known before?
Yeah, so nothing in that report was really a surprise. I mean, it basically confirmed mostly what we knew. I mean, I think kind of the most revealing aspects of it was just how closely everything was coordinated. Like every strike, it got into some of the big ones when Ukraine took out Russia's Black Sea one of their big ships in the Black Sea Fleet. I'm blanking on the name of it, but that happened early on in the war. And there was, that revealed that it was coordinates that the U.S. gave Ukraine. The report said that the U.S. wasn't happy that they sank the ship, that they didn't want them to do that. Some of that stuff, I think, might be the U.S. trying to act like they were a little less enthusiastic about certain things. It also said that the U.S. was unhappy about Ukraine invading Kursk when they launched the invasion of Russia last year. But yeah, I mean, again, it really showed just confirmed that the targeting intelligence right away. There was a lot of Russian generals killed at first, and that report said, each one of those strikes, it was the U.S. says, oh, here they are, hit them. And then, they would move their generals, their officers back and say, oh, now they're here, hit them. And the Ukrainians would hit them. And I mean, this is you can just imagine, it sounds almost cliche to say now, but put the shoe on the other foot. We can't even imagine. You remember the Taliban bounty story, the claim that the Russians were putting bounties on the head of U.S. troops in Afghanistan? Well, this is the U.S. actually directly helping kill Russian, senior Russian officers and everything. And the breakdown of communications between the U.S. and Russia, Biden really did bring the world to the brink with this proxy war. And this is, more confirmation of that.
Is there any good news on the foreign policy front? I hate to ask such a dumb question, but is there anything encouraging anywhere?
I mean, I do think the Ukraine stuff is again, because what it will take for a peace deal and a real ceasefire in Ukraine is a repairing of U.S.-Russia relations, a rebuilding of trust. And that could take a long time. So the fact that that's happening is good. I mean, it's horrific that the war continues, that people are still being killed. Because, I mean, that was one of my favorite things about what Trump was saying on the campaign, was that he wants the killing to stop. And he knows how he could stop it. He could stop giving Ukraine military aid. He paused it briefly after that blow up in the Oval Office. I mean, he had the perfect opportunity there to just say, that's it, make a deal now, done. But he didn't. So it's unfortunate that continues, but I think that's really the biggest bright spot. Anything else? I'm trying to think. I mean, the situation in the Middle East right now is really bad. And I'm not one to be kind of hyperbolic in predicting bad things happening or wars breaking out. But we are on the course for a war with Iran. And it's not, I don't envision a U.S. invasion of Iran, but the U.S. and Israel bombing them, and then Iran hitting a bunch of American bases with missiles, and there could be thousands of U.S. casualties. And then what happens? We're in this world now where an American president can just bomb a country, no authorization from Congress needed. We've been in this world for a while, but now it's all the things you would think for war with Iran, we would need a debate. They would even need to propagandize the people first. They don't even really need to do that. If they just bomb Iran and then Iran kills some Americans, then that's it. We're at war. So I know I'm supposed to be saying good things about the foreign policy, but I'm having trouble thinking about them.
Yeah, I get it.
Because there was, when.
Well, I was just going to say, there are a lot of opportunities for Iran to hit Americans because there's so darn many American military bases all over the world. There's this great video the other day by Jimmy Dore where he was spinning a globe showing the location of all these military bases. He's saying other countries don't have this. Other countries don't have a globe-spanning series of bases. Then his leftism came through because he says this is where capitalism ultimately winds up. But there's nothing capitalist about military bases that are built with stolen money. That's not how capitalism works. But, fair enough, we'll leave that aside. But they're everywhere. No one, even the America Firsters, seem to have absolutely no interest in rolling any of it back. That would still be considered an extreme opinion.
Yeah. And, there were some hopeful signs when Trump first came in, with the Gaza ceasefire happening, and now that's all blown up. And I mean, there's just been massacres in Gaza for 2 weeks now, just absolutely horrific, as bad as it's been. And that's all being directly supported by the U.S. And that, that's the source of everything, all the tension in the region right now. So, another good sign was some of the people that he put in his administration. This guy, Mike DiMino, who's a former CIA guy. He was with Defense Priorities, which is like a realist think tank. In his position, and he got a lot of heat for this when he was first appointed to the position. There was like smear campaign against them, basically, because he was saying that the U.S. basically has no interest in the Middle East, that we could bring all the troops home from Iraq and Syria, from kind of like the hot spots, and close down bases and wind down the U.S. presence. And he's the head of Middle East policy in the Pentagon. So the fact that he's there, I guess, he's not winning. They're not listening to him. So, I mean, the hope would be, I guess, that if this Yemen thing drags on and there's no good results from it, then maybe Trump starts listening to somebody else about it. But I don't know, because, you saw that group chat, the Signal chat.
I was going to
somehow the scandals. Yeah. Because we saw J.D. Vance, saying, I don't know about this, basically saying, he said he thought it would be a mistake to bomb Yemen. And his reasoning was that, and this is something Thomas Massey has said, barely any U.S. trade goes through this part of the world. He kind of framed it as like, oh, we're not going to bail the Europeans out, even though it's more about,
right. But
ensuring Israel.
My guess is that I am entirely guessing here, but my guess is that he said that because he thinks only that kind of argument will ever resonate with some of these people.
Yeah, I was thinking that too. Because, I mean, he's smart enough that he actually probably knows the real causes here. But
yeah.
So we did see that, a little bit of, they weren't all on board. He did say it was excellent after Mike Waltz said that they bombed a residential building. Yeah. That was just really something. And Tulsi Gabbard in there. Like, man. But so the fact that there is some maybe split, I don't even know if it's really a split, but at least someone, and Vance seems to have a pretty influential, as a vice president, he's very visible, and seems like he has some influence on foreign policy. So hopefully, I don't know, there's some internal battle in the administration right now between some of these more realist people, and maybe they have a chance of changing things. But I mean, could you imagine right now, like, I know U.S. Navy ships in the Red Sea, like their air defenses are super advanced. It would be very hard for the Houthis to get a missile or a drone past, but let's say they do. I mean, just imagine an incident right now with the way Trump has been carrying on, with all these threats, with the way Pete Hegseth has been acting, and like Mike Waltz. If like a few dozen American troops get killed, or like a few get killed and more get injured, I don't think they're going to just say, oh, we shouldn't be here. It's a mistake. Let's get out. I think the response is going to be, well, bring out the B-2 bombers and, let's do it. And like, so there's always that risk of a U.S. casualties. I think could really, really escalate things.
Yeah. And, so no one ever thinks the way Reagan thought in Beirut in, I think, 1982, when there was a big hit on some U.S. Marines. And he just said, look, this is ridiculous. We have no business being over there. So he drew exactly the opposite conclusion from what basically everybody would say today. Well, this means we have to double down on the idiotic policy.
I call it like it's do something-ism is kind of the attitude of the federal branch these days. Like whenever Biden did the same thing, 3 U.S. troops were killed in Jordan on a secretive base there in Tower 22, and those were the result of rocket and drone attacks that were a response to the U.S. support for the Gaza slaughter. And, he launched all these airstrikes, killed dozens of, like it's never, maybe we shouldn't keep them exposed in these bases where they don't have any real defenses and get them out of there. It's not, let's just bomb them more and, we're going to stay. And so, and especially with Trump, because that's kind of the message from the Trump administration, from the Republicans, that Biden was weak. Biden didn't bomb the Houthis hard enough. We lost deterrence. So then if they do get hit, then I think the response is going to be really completely unproportional.
Yeah. And that's the approach domestically too. Every time there's a crisis, whether it was COVID or the housing crash, we got to do something. And this something is always worse than nothing. And every case, it's always worse. But they feel they have to be perceived as doing something. And in this case, they usually don't need to be pushed into it. They want to do it. It's not the public makes them do it. Even if after the fact, sometimes the public eventually goes along. They're all too happy to do it. So so if that's where things stand now, oh well, you know what? Hold on a minute. We mentioned that signal crisis, signal scandal, I guess we'll call it, that I think everybody knows about. That they were discussing Hegseth, the vice president. They were discussing the bombing of Yemen inside Signal, which is a private messaging app, but which is not authorized for that kind of use by the federal government. And there was an Atlantic reporter that was somehow in the group. So this is the thing that the Democrats hit hard, was that they had done this. But it just goes to show, if only we had a two-party system when it comes to foreign policy, they might say that the real problem was the bombing of Yemen. That was the problem. But they are so implicated in this themselves that they can't plausibly make that criticism. So instead, we get arguments about what method was used to discuss the policy, rather than arguing about the policy.
Yeah, that's a good point about the bipartisanship, because the war in Yemen, like U.S. intervention in Yemen, is super bipartisan. I mean, Obama really ramped up the drone war there back in 2009, and then he was the one to back the Saudis there. An important point, one that Scott always makes, which is important to bring up when we talk about this, is that the U.S. was cooperating with the Houthis against al-Qaeda that same year, that then they turned around and backed the Saudis against them, and then al-Qaeda was the U.S.'s ally against the Houthis in Yemen. Always important to bring that up. But anyway, it is a very bipartisan conflict, all the way around. I mean, Biden just bombed them for a whole year, and barely anybody even noticed that. I mean, you mentioned the Signal thing the other day in the Oval Office. All these reporters are asking Trump about Signal. He's like, whatever. It's not a big deal. We should really be talking about bombing in Yemen. It's been wildly successful. It's been great. It's been so great. We're bombing Yemen every day. And then they keep asking him questions about the Signal, and he's like trying to deflect by talking about bombing another country. And he said, it's been very successful. I'm going to be doing it for a long time. Like he's sitting there saying, I'm going to be conducting this war, this unauthorized illegal war for a long, and no reporter said, well, actually, it hasn't been that successful because the Houthis are hitting back. And what do you mean? Like, what's your plan? There's no long-term strategy here for Yemen. And the reporters just didn't even want anything to do with questioning that. So yeah, it really is amazing how the scandal has become. I mean, it is kind of amazing to see that, like a group chat basically preparing a war, but that's the story, and not the fact that the U.S. is bombing Yemen. I mean, this should be the thing that people are outraged about.
Let me, in case we have any youngsters in the audience who may not appreciate the significance of antiwar.com. Antiwar.com opened its doors all the way back in 1995. So this is actually 30 years for you guys, if I'm getting it right.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, I mean, you guys should make some kind of hay out of that 30 years of this. And it was in the middle of conflicts in the Balkans. And I remember the story of Eric Garris saying to Justin Raimondo, we should buy the domain antiwar.com. But this is a very, very early stage of the internet. And some people still didn't fully get that it would be as central to our lives as it has become. And Justin thought, well, I guess if you want to go do this oddball thing, you could go buy it. And it turns out what a valuable thing it is. And thank goodness antiwar.com is in the hands of, basically libertarians rather than people who would confuse the message and drive people away with left-wing baggage. So it's really, but yet at the same time, antiwar.com has been very ecumenical in the kinds of articles it features, the kinds of authors it highlights. You don't have to be an ideological clone of Scott Horton or Dave DeCamp here to publish on antiwar.com. So it's been super, super valuable. I don't know what I would have done during the war in Iraq if I hadn't had the reporting of antiwar.com. It's absolutely indispensable. And I hope you guys will consider helping it out because, there are big foundations out there that sit around and accomplish nothing, but yet attract millions, tens of millions of dollars, hundreds of millions of dollars sometimes, and that they just basically might as well light on fire in terms of what gets done with it. But on a shoestring budget, antiwar.com is like the beacon of hope for the whole world. And so if you're thinking, I really owe it to somebody out there who's doing this important work to chip in a little, I would say antiwar.com is a pretty good outlet for that. Dave, I presume you agree.
Yeah. Thank you. I really appreciate that. And we are doing our fundraiser right now. And like you mentioned, we have a shoestring budget. Our money is spent, your money's spent very efficiently. It basically goes to paying the staff, and none of us take big salaries by any means, and paying contributors and just running the site. We have, we're like, it is really great. I'm blessed to be able to work for antiwar.com because, like I mentioned, it was 2018 when I started writing. So I haven't been doing this too long. And as you said, there was kind of a lull in foreign policy at the time. There wasn't as much attention on it. So I think that was why the opportunity was there for me. But what we try to provide, Justin was like the genius writer for so many years that really built up the following of antiwar.com, and we lost him in 2019. So it's been a while now. But we've really tried to keep the spirit of Justin alive. And like you said, we have columnists and we run stuff from all over the political spectrum. But we are run, basically the whole staff is libertarian. It's run by libertarians, and it is a really great project to be involved in. And so, what I do, like my role as the news editor, is the idea is that if you just pay attention to the news, not even too closely, you get a much better understanding of the things that are happening around the world, so that when the U.S. starts bombing Yemen, seemingly out of nowhere for a lot of people, if you read antiwar.com, you understand, you would have known that it was coming. There were signs in the weeks leading up to it that we were covering, and you would know why it's a mistake. So I just think, we do, not to pat myself on the back too much, but I think our news coverage these days is really important, and we try to put out a lot of content. So if people appreciate it, we could always use the help. There's not much money in the anti-war business.
No, there isn't. So I hope you guys will help antiwar.com out. I've donated a lot to antiwar.com over the years, and always felt like I got more than my money's worth in terms of what they're doing. So, Dave, thanks very much for that work and for your time today.
Thanks, Tom. Thanks so much for having me.
And thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
Make yourself and those you love less vulnerable to the regime, both mentally and physically. Get more forbidden information at tomsfreebooks.com, and be sure to subscribe to the show wherever you listen. See you next time.
Like the sound of The Tom Woods Show? My audio production is provided by Podsworth Media. Check them out at podsworth.com.